Good morning, fourth graders and Mrs. Dye and Mrs. Gibson. I'm going to go ahead and read the remainder of Jump Ship to Freedom to you today. So here goes. We are on chapter 14. It was a pretty sight, with ships everywhere in a forest of masts and bowsprits sticking out over the harbor street. It was just as busy as New York Harbor. Men everywhere, loading ships from wagons, and loading wagons from ships, or just lounging around. Stacks of casks and boxes and piles of hay and barrels. Small boats filled with fruit and vegetables tied to the wharves. There was a pretty good number of blacks around, too. One old fellow was sitting there smoking a pipe and playing strange tunes on a kind of fiddle made of gourds. I didn't want to go drifting around New York Harbor in a stolen boat any longer than I had to. So I pulled up to the first dock I came to, tied up and climbed out, trying not to look nervous. And I was wrong there, I misspoke. He's not in New York Harbor, he's in Philadelphia's harbor. I walked along the wharves a good way so as to be away from the boat I'd stolen in case somebody came along and recognized it. Then I leaned up against a wall and waited until a black person came along, and I asked him how to get to the State House. It wasn't hard to get to, he said, and told me the way. In about 20 minutes, I was standing in front of it, feeling pretty nervous. I tell you, it was a fine, great place, all brick with lots of big windows sparkling in the sun, and carvings and patterns in the moldings around the door. There were gravel walks along the front and some little elm trees they'd just planted. And that wasn't all of it either. On each side, there was stone and brick buildings near as large as the State House. One of them was a prison. I could see that right away. Some of the prisoners was standing by the bars hollering out into the street. A few of them had got long poles, which they tied their caps to and stuck through the bars into the street so people could put pennies in the caps if they were feeling kind and had a mind to do it. And if nobody put anything in a cap, why, the man who owned it would set up the most terrible cursing you ever heard. As I stood there watching the prisoners, it came to me that if Captain Ivers caught me, I might end up there too. But it was too late to worry about that. There were stone arches on either side between the State House and the other buildings. The arches opened onto a mall which ran out to the back. I walked through one of the arches. Just past it, there was a door. I walked up to the steps and opened it. I was mighty scared to go into a place of such importance, me being low as dirt, and my hand shook on the knob. But I knew I had to do it. So I went on in. I was in a big hall. There was lots of people in fancy clothes walking around and talking to each other. Some of them was delegates to the convention, I reckoned, and was bound to be famous, but I couldn't tell which. Just inside the door, there stood a soldier in blue with a sword on one side of his belt and a pistol on the other. He put his arm out. "Hold up there, you," he said. "Delivery's around to the rear." My knees was shaken. "I have a message for somebody, sir." "All right, give it to me." "It ain't written out, sir. It's in my head." He stared at me. "I don't believe that. Nobody'd give a black person a message in his head. No black boy could ever get anything like that straight." It made me mad, him saying that after all the trouble I'd been through to get there. "It's important," I said. "Sure," he said. "They always are." I was getting madder and madder. "It's from Mr. William Samuel Johnson." "Sure," he said, "and I'm the Queen of May. Now run along before I lock you up." I could feel tears coming up behind my eyes. I was so mad. "I have to see him. I'm not lying. It's important." And just then I realized that a very fancy-dressed man, no bigger than me, was staring at me. "Guard," the man said, "please remove this black boy from the doorway so a gentleman can pass through." The guard grabbed me by the arm and jerked me away. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hamilton," he said. He's been trying to tell me that he has a message for Mr. William Samuel Johnson." "No doubt," Mr. Hamilton said. I knew right away who it was. Mr. Alexander Hamilton, one of the most famous of all the men at the convention. He started to go for the door. I was scared to death, but I knew I had to do something. "Sir," I said, "I ain't lying. It's important." Mr. Hamilton snapped his head around. "Guard, would you please keep this boy away from me?" The guard grabbed for my arm and jerked me back hard away from Mr. Hamilton. "I ain't lying," I cried out. "It's for Mr. Johnson from Mr. Fotherscreft." Hamilton was halfway out the door, but he stopped dead, spun around. "Fotherscreft? Well, where is he? He was due here yesterday." "He's dead, sir. He died of the cough last night at Trenton. He was mighty sick." "Dead? Fotherscreft is dead?" He was speaking in a loud voice, and I noticed that some of the other men in the hall had turned to look at us. "Yes, sir." "And he gave you a message for us?" "For Mr. Johnson, sir." "Well, all right, give it to me." 2 or 3 other men had walked over to us and were standing there listening. "I can't tell it to anybody but Mr. Johnson." "What?" Mr. Hamilton shouted. "Well, I'll wring your neck, you impudent little wretch." He snatched at my shirt front. "Now tell me." My mouth was bone dry and I could hardly talk. But scared as I was of Mr. Hamilton, I was more scared of going back on a promise to a dying man and being haunted all the rest of my life. "I can't, sir," I said. "I promised Mr. Fotherscreft. I can't go back on my promise." He let go of my shirt. "What's your name, boy?" "Daniel Erebus," I said. "Erebus?" Now one of the other men who had been standing by pushed forward. "What's all the commotion, Hamilton?" "This boy says he has a message from Fotherscreft, General." "What is your name, boy?" I was scared before. Now I was about ready to drop down onto the floor in a dead faint, for it was General Washington. I'd seen his picture hanging in Francis's Tavern. It was him, sure enough. "Erebus, sir," I sort of gasped out. "My daddy fought with you." "He did he? Well, maybe I remember." "Was it Trenton?" "Where's he now?" "He drowned, sir. He went out in the Katy Lee this spring and he never came back." He helped you across a stream once. He held your horse." General Washington smiled and some of the others laughed. "I don't remember that. I do remember the fighting at Trenton." And when he said that, the picture of my daddy came into my mind. I saw him standing there, brave and strong, looking down at me, and I began to feel braver and stronger myself. "Okay, a little time out here. Be right back." Just had to get a tissue. Mr. Hamilton turned to General Washington. "He has a message for Dr. Johnson. It's obviously word of the negotiations on the slavery issue. He says Fotherscreft is dead, and he won't tell anybody but Johnson. We'll have to wring it out of him." "There's no need of that, Mr. Hamilton," General Washington said. "I won't ask the boy to go back on a deathbed promise. Dr. Johnson is in the writing room with one of his constituents." He took my arm. "We'll go see him, shall we, Erebus?" We marched on with General Washington on one side of me and Mr. Hamilton on the other, and some of the other men coming along behind. Oh, I was scared half to death to be with such famous men. We crossed the hall and then turned into a little room filled with fancy furniture, big captain's chairs, lots of tables, and 2 fireplaces. I looked around, and that's when I got the most awful shock. Dr. Johnson was sitting at one of the tables with some papers in front of him, and sitting opposite of him was Captain Ivers. The minute Captain Ivers saw me, he jumped to his feet. "Erebus!" he shouted. And then he looked at General Washington, sort of confused. Dr. Johnson stood up too. Your runaway slave seems to have come back to you, Captain, he said. He has a message from Peter Fatherskreft, General Washington said. He won't give it to anybody but you, Johnson. Fatherskreft? Well, at last, where is the old soul? He's dead, sir. He died last night at Trenton. Dead? Yes, sir, I said. He was mighty sick all the way down. He shouldn't ought to have been traveling. And he gave you a message? Yes, sir. He said I wasn't to tell it to anybody but you. Well, you have Dr. Johnson now, boy, Mr. Hamilton said. I looked up at him and then at General Washington and finally at Dr. Johnson. I ain't supposed to tell it to anybody but Dr. Johnson, I said kind of low. General Washington smiled. All right, Erebus. Come, gentlemen, let us leave these two to their business. Captain Ivers gave me a hard look like he was warning me not to run off again, but he didn't dare go against General Washington. They all went out. Dr. Johnson sat down, and I stood in front of him and told him the whole message. Then he asked me a lot of questions about the message, just to make sure I got it right and wasn't lying about the whole thing. And how did you happen to meet Mr. Fatherskreft in the first place, Daniel? He asked. According to Captain Ivers, you jumped ship and ran away. Well, there wasn't any point in lying about that. Yes, sir, I ran away. Captain Ivers, he was going to sell me off south. How did you know that? I heard him tell Birdsey. Birdsey? He's Captain Ivers' nephew, I said. Or he was, sir. He got washed overboard in a storm on the way down. Oh, yes, now I remember him. He was drowned? Yes, sir. You've had a lot of hard luck recently, Daniel, he said. Yes, sir, I guess I have. Nor was that all of it. I reached into my shirt and took out the oilcloth package. Captain Ivers is after my daddy's soldier's notes. Well, I don't understand. So I told him all about it. How Mrs. Ivers had taken them from Mum, how I'd stolen them back, and us planning on asking him to help us sell them so as to get our freedom money. He just sat there and listened, nodded, and asked a question here and there, and when I got finished with the whole story, he said, And you knew that Captain Ivers was in Philadelphia? I reckoned he would be, knowing that me and Mr. Fatherskreft was headed that way, I said. And you came down anyway? Yes, sir. I couldn't go back on a promise to a dying man. He thought about it for a minute. And then he said, You know, Daniel, I'm constantly surprised. It's generally said that Africans don't have a true moral sense the same as whites do. Sir, I've been looking at the whole thing pretty hard the past little while, and it seems to me that there ain't much difference one way or another. You take my daddy and Big Tom and Mr. Ivers and Birdsey and me, and you take the skin off of us, and it would be pretty hard to tell which was the white ones and which ones wasn't. That's not what most white people believe. It ain't what most black folks believe either. I didn't believe it myself back home, but my daddy, he believed it, and I reckon I believe it now myself. He didn't say anything for another minute, and then he said, Well now, Daniel, you understand that I have to turn you back to Captain Ivers. You're his property, and that's the law in Connecticut. I guess I know that as well as anybody, I said. He gave me a sharp look to see if I was being uppity, but I wasn't. I'd said it. I wasn't sorry I'd said it. I suppose you do, he said. But did you know that it's also the law in Pennsylvania? However, I can see to it that he doesn't sell you for a while, all right. Your father performed a service for the country, and now you've performed another one at considerable personal sacrifice. It's the least we can do. I'm sure that General Washington will agree with me, and I doubt strongly that Captain Ivers will want to oppose the general's wishes. Sir, I don't want to be uppity, but there's Mum. Oh, your mother too. He smiled, and then he got serious again. Daniel, there's a lot of talk in Connecticut about passing a law forbidding the selling of slaves out of the state. I think such a law will pass, and if it does, You and your mother won't have to worry about being sold away. Sir, there's my daddy's soldier's notes. Do you think they'll ever be worth anything? Dr. Johnson thought about that for a minute. It's hard to predict, he said, but I think they will. Now that we've got an agreement on the slavery issue, I'm pretty confident we'll get a constitution to form a new nation with. And it's my belief that the new government will pay off the notes. I could feel the tears come up behind my eyes, and I blinked to keep from crying. So Mom and me could buy ourselves free? He thought about that some more. Daniel, I think the smart thing would be for you to give me those notes for safekeeping. If the government votes to pay them off, I'll make an arrangement with Captain Ivers to obtain your freedom and your mother's. And that was what happened. Over the next few years, Connecticut passed laws saying we couldn't be sold away from the state. The Constitution was voted on too, and the 13 little countries was organized into the United States. And soon the new government decided to pay off the soldiers' notes. Dr. Johnson took our notes to Captain Ivers and made a deal with him. And after that, we were free. Oh, I can tell you the day me and Mom packed our clothes and walked out of Captain Ivers' house was the greatest feeling I ever had. It was like the whole world for years and years had been in the clouds. And then the sun came out. Mom knew where there was a little old lean-to house in Stratford we could borrow. She figured she'd go to work for Dr. Johnson in his house. And I figured I'd go to sea for a while, save up some money, and buy my own fishing boat. So we walked away. And after a bit, we got to the lean-to. There wasn't much to it, just a little shingle place with the roof half fallen in and the chimney needing work. We could fix all that up. The most important thing was, it was ours. It was the first time in our lives we'd had a place of our own. We went in and began figuring what to do to the roof. But even though it was a happy day for us, I could see that Mom was looking a little bit sad, and I knew what it was, too. She was thinking about all the ones that wasn't with us on that day. She was thinking about my Aunt Willie, who'd run off to New York. Now we didn't know where she was. She was thinking about Birdsey, who'd got washed overboard and drowned. Most of all, she was thinking about my daddy. For if it wasn't for him fighting all those years in the Revolution, we'd have never got free. But I didn't say anything. And we started in on the roof, and after a while, I heard Mom singing, and I knew she was looking down the road ahead. And that, my friends, is the end of Jump Ship to Freedom. So I hope you enjoyed the ending. And I think I'll probably start another book for you. So maybe you can let Mrs. Dye know if you have a favorite book you'd like to hear. Otherwise, I think I'll be reading Owls in the Family when we next get together. And I'll also make a video of the poetry that I usually read to you. So anyway, stay well, stay safe, and we'll see you all again soon. Goodbye.